Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 13th lecture in our course on general psychology. In this lecture, we'll wrap up our unit on memory. And in particular, we'll talk about what your book calls the 7 sins of memory. So, the 7 sins are errors in our memory process. And so, we'll talk about what are they? So, what are the errors that we tend to make? And usually, this is not without our awareness. In fact, many of them, it's only after a fair amount of study that we're able to get a handle on what those errors are, how common they are, and also what causes them. So, what stage in our memory process do these errors occur at? And what is it about that process that allows these errors to happen? And these errors, we call them errors, and they can be inconvenient when we notice them. But the fact is that these errors occur for a reason in many cases. That our brain and our memory system in particular have evolved to handle our environment, all the stimuli that we have to deal with. And so these errors are really side effects, often of an otherwise efficient memory process. So we'll talk about why we have these errors in our memory process and what good they do for the most part. So what we're going to do in particular is see that these errors occur at different stages in memory. It's not that one stage of memory is particularly flawed and that the others are perfect. These errors happen at every stage. No stage is perfect. And also, a lot of these errors occur because of outside influences on our memory. In particular, we'll talk about how suggestible our memories are and how easy it is for us to misremember things, to sort of merge memories, and believe, of course, that it's still an accurate reflection of the past. And as always, we'll talk about the brain. How is the brain involved both in the memory process and in the errors that occur in the memory process? So we'll cover all of those things by the end of this lecture. So the first so-called sin, as your book calls it, is what is called transience. And what transience is something that happens to all of us. We forget what has happened to us. We forget past events. And the more that time goes on, the more we tend to forget. So this is a failure in storage. This information was stored at one point, and then suddenly it is no longer stored. And so we talked last time about the different stages in memory. We talked about encoding. We talked about storage. We talked about retrieval. And also processes like consolidation, by which information gets from short-term to long-term memory. And what's interesting is that this is not a constant effect through time. It's not that you're just as likely to forget a detail 5 years after the memory is formed as you are 5 minutes after the memory is formed. This tends to happen a lot more shortly after formation of the memory. And so in the first few minutes or first hour, you're far more likely to forget the information than you are after 48 hours. If you've retained it for 47 hours, odds are you'll have it 48 hours after the memory is formed. So it's not a constant effect of time. It is much more upfront, so to speak, in terms of when you're likely to forget something. And the thing is, would you really want to remember everything? At the beginning of your chapter, you read about a woman named Jill Price, who is not unique. There are lots of people that have her ability, but she has an excellent autobiographical memory, an excellent episodic memory. She can remember details of any day as soon as you name the date. Uh, and while that sounds like it might be a good ability to have, uh, for Jill Price, it is actually sort of a nuisance. She can't forget anything. She's constantly uh, remembering all sorts of details about her life, and it becomes very intrusive. So remembering everything is not the blessing it might initially sound like. The reason we forget so much is that a lot of what we experience isn't important, isn't relevant to our day-to-day life, and so it doesn't need to be accessible to us all the time. And this brings up two related concepts, and these are ideas of what are called interference. So there is retroactive interference, in which the new information that we require interferes with previous information. And so if we learn the name of a new acquaintance, it might be difficult to remember the names of old friends. We've acquired new information, and so it becomes difficult to remember the old information, especially if the two kinds of information are related. We talked last time about how long-term memory doesn't have a known capacity. So it's not that your memory fills up, and so you have to bump something off in order to fit something new in. It's just that because they're related concepts, new information tends to be recalled when what you're trying to do is retrieve that older information. The opposite, of course, is proactive interference. I think your book uses a good example here, that after you've been going to work every day for a week, that it can be hard to remember where you parked your car on Friday because you parked your car on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday. And so all that previous information is interfering with your ability to remember what you just did. And so there's the opposite. Older information is interfering with your ability to store new information. So both these kinds of interference occur, and they inhibit our ability to retrieve the desired piece of information. Another sin is what is called absent-mindedness. And this is a lapse in attention that causes memory failure. And this is a common problem. We've all experienced this. And so perhaps we have a task in mind that we want to get done by the end of the day, or we're going somewhere and there's something we need to remember to bring along with us, and we forget because we're so occupied trying to get ready for the journey. And the problem here is that attention is a finite resource. You only have so much attention. You can't pay attention to everything at once. And so if something distracts you, or some task suddenly becomes more important, if only for a moment, um, that can grab our attention, and then perhaps our attention doesn't return to our original goal or that original item. And so this brings up the idea of prospective memory, which is remembering something for the future. It's not an event that's already occurred. It's when we try to remember to do something. So we set a goal for ourselves, and sometimes that gets done, and sometimes it doesn't because other things come up. And so that prospective memory is that our ability to set tasks for ourselves in the future. And one thing that happens when your attention is divided is that your frontal lobe decreases in activity. We unfortunately don't have enough time in this course to really talk about attention in detail, but it is part of our psychological world that is important and that has received a lot of study. And so when your attention is occupied by multiple tasks or multiple items, activity in your frontal lobe decreases, and so does activity in the hippocampus, which we see here in the lower right in this new figure. And so we see the hippocampus activity decrease, and we already know from last time that the hippocampus is important for episodic memory, that if you lose both your hippocampi, that you often cannot store new episodic memories. And so given that absent-mindedness has such a large episodic component, it's something we're trying to do while we're going about our daily lives and experiencing one event after another. That hippocampus and the frontal lobe seem to have a role in this sin of absent-mindedness. There's also the phenomenon of blocking. And this is not a failure to store information. This is a failure to retrieve information, even though you're trying as hard as you can. And so we've all experienced this as well. We're trying to remember that piece of information. Maybe it's somebody's name. Maybe it's where we left an important item. uh, and it's on the tip of our tongue, so to speak. We can't quite remember it, but we know the information is there somewhere. So it's a failure to retrieve it, even though it has been stored. And oftentimes, you'll remember the information later, especially if a relevant cue comes up. That if you get another clue as to what the name is or where the item was left behind, uh, those cues can actually call the information to mind. So it is stored somewhere, but it's a failure of retrieval. And one of the key ingredients here is how meaningful the information is. So one of the reasons that names are hard to remember is that there's nothing about somebody's appearance or the way they dress or how they act that automatically brings to mind what their name is. Whereas their appearance or how they dress might give you a very good clue as to what their occupation is or where they're from. And so certain kinds of information are not conceptually related as strongly to the cues we're given at all times. And so certain kinds of information are harder to retrieve than others. Place names and people's names can be a little bit arbitrary. Uh, the locations of household items can be a little bit arbitrary. And so it can be hard to remember these things. And especially when it comes to naming things, the temporal lobe seems to be particularly important. And so when you are trying to recall a name, for example, the temporal lobe becomes highly active. And on a related note, if you have temporal lobe damage, uh, then it actually becomes harder to remember information such as names. Harder to recall it, that is. And so there's evidence that the temporal lobe is involved in that particular process of retrieving names, for example. Another error that we make is what is called memory misattribution. And this is where we retrieve the information successfully, but we assign it to the wrong source. We get some part of it wrong in terms of our recollection. And so this brings up the idea of what is called source memory, which is the sort of the when, where, and how of acquisition. And so there might be a fact that we all know, what the capital of the United States is, for example. And while we know that fact, that's readily accessible. You probably can't remember when and where and how you first learned it. And so we can have a piece of information and not necessarily recall the context of acquisition for it. Or perhaps you know the face and the identity of your friend very well, but you may not remember when you first met them, what context it was, where it was. And so those are two different concepts, what the information is, and when, where, and how you first learned it. And it's much harder to recollect the second one. And related to misattribution is the idea of false recognition. And this is where you claim that you know something and you feel like you do. It's not an act of deception. That you feel familiar with something that is actually new, that you haven't actually seen before or heard before. And so people will often report familiarity with something that is actually new to them. And of course, this has huge implications for our society and for things like our justice system. So your book uses the example of an eyewitness claiming that there was an accomplice in the Oklahoma City bombing, when in fact there was no accomplice, and that the person that the witness reported was actually just in the person's store at around the same time. So that association was false. That 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 memory of the individual had been misattributed to a different place and time. And this is one of the reasons that eyewitness testimony is not nearly as reliable as you might otherwise think. Uh, and there are people who think that it should take less of a place in our legal system. Eyewitness testimony historically is one of the most relied upon kinds of evidence in our legal system. But given decades of memory research, We know that it is not nearly as reliable as other forms of physical evidence. And so the ideas of false recognition, memory misattribution, are really important when it comes to our society. They're not just sort of interesting psychological phenomena. They do actually matter. And one of the reasons we think this happens is through the activation of related concepts. This is illustrated perhaps most easily with experiments, where if you give people a list of words, uh, and if the words all share a common theme, that often people will report words that aren't on the list that also share that theme. Because at the level of the brain, if you activate this set of neurons that hold together this concept and a related concept over here, another concept over here, that related concepts might also get activated because all these neurons might connect to one another. So you have sort of networks of neurons that represent semantically related ideas. And so if you give someone the words needle and thimble and sew, they might misremember the word thread being on the list because thread is semantically related to those other ideas, to those other words. And so again, at the brain level, uh, these sets of neurons might also get activated because they're connected to those neurons that represent thimble and sew and needle. Now, what's also interesting is that your brain doesn't seem to be able to tell the difference between true recognition and false recognition. This uh, feeling of familiarity with something that's actually not familiar at all. So this graph of activity we see here in the bottom left in the hippocampus, we see that the level of activity for true and false recognitions are actually pretty close to one another. So it's not that we're misinterpreting what these different parts of our brain are telling us. Uh, these different parts of our brain actually don't seem to be able to differentiate between true memories and false memories. So what do we do about it? How do we address memory misattribution? Well, one thing to think about is that just being given one stimulus and asked whether it's familiar or not tends to make people say that it is familiar. However, if you give people two stimuli and ask them to indicate which of the two they've seen before, they're actually pretty good at that. So just giving one stimulus in isolation tends to give this false sense of familiarity because they just have one stimulus. They're not really forced to come up with the details to retrieve detailed information about that memory. Whereas if you give them two pretty similar stimuli and ask them which one is familiar, well, there, the stimuli are pretty close. There you need more details. And so people tend to retrieve more information and make accurate judgments to avoid this misattribution. Another common problem is suggestibility. And this is where we have a memory, but we also incorporate external information that's misleading, that causes us to uh, miscommunicate or to misremember experiences in our life, for example. This idea of false memories, that you have some life experience, perhaps you record it fairly accurately in your memory, but then, based on external cues later, uh, you misremember the phenomenon. You misdescribe it when you're asked to relate what happened. And here there are two big influences. Uh, one big one is social pressure. So especially if you have an authority figure that asks you leading questions, uh, this can have a big influence on what you report. And again, this is not active deception. This is not an individual knowing what they actually experienced and then reporting something else. These are actual false memories. People really think that this is what they experienced, when in fact it was because someone around them suggested that it happened. Uh, Also, the influence of imagination. They've done studies where they ask you to imagine that you've done a particular behavior or to remember a past event in a different way than it actually happened. And the more you're told to imagine it that way, later on, if you're asked to recall what happened, the more likely you are to report the imagined version. And so using your imagination and also being subjected to social pressure can actually change how you remember events. And this came up in a big way in the 80s and early 90s when uh, certain psychotherapists had patients that reported childhood abuse. And it turns out that these recollections uh, were actually false. That the psychotherapist had asked leading questions about childhood abuse. And the questions were structured such that it was suggested that the patient had actually undergone childhood abuse. Now, this is not to say that childhood abuse does not occur. Of course, it does. And this is not to say that the individuals never accurately remember childhood abuse. They often do. But when the psychotherapist suggests that abuse has occurred when it has not, uh, the patient can be suggestible. That is, they can incorporate this new information, the suggestion, into their memories, and then later on report that something has happened when in fact it hasn't. And this was a big issue because people actually went to jail over this for having abused their children when in fact they hadn't, and they were later released because these memories turned out to be false. And it doesn't have to be these complex social influences. Something as simple as the wording one chooses can really determine what someone recollects. So there's a famous study by Loftus and Palmer uh, where they showed people a video of two cars in a collision, and then they asked people to estimate how fast the cars were going. All the participants saw the same video; they'd witnessed the same events. But what Loftus and Palmer did was change a single word in the question. So they asked how fast the cars were going when they smashed into each other, or when they collided into each other, or when they bumped into each other. And the verb that was used had a big impact on that estimate. And so, again, they'd all witnessed the same video, they had the exact same information, but this one word in the question changed their recollection, changed how they described what had happened. And so it doesn't have to be a complex influence. It can be a very simple influence on our memories when it comes to suggestibility. So another sin of memory is bias. And bias is the distortion of our recollection of previous experiences by our present knowledge or beliefs or our emotions. And so one form in which this comes is consistency bias. And the idea here is that we tend to think of ourselves as pretty consistent over time. And so if we're asked how we felt about something 10 years ago, we're likely to report something that's fairly correlated with how we feel now, even though people change over time. Your political beliefs 10 years ago may have been very different from your political beliefs now. And yet, if you're asked now, you tend to sort of retroactively align your recollection of your beliefs with your current ones. And so your recollection of your past is very much filtered through your perception of yourself now. You also have the opposite, of course. You have change bias. And your book uses the example of a romantic partner. How do you view your relationship now as opposed to 4 years ago? How happy are you with it? Uh, how emotionally connected are you to your partner? Uh, and people will report, of course, being less connected or uh, being less content with their partner in the past than they are now. Uh, and the idea for both of these things is expectation. We expect ourselves to be pretty consistent, but certain aspects of our lives we do expect to change. So we expect our relationships to grow, even if perhaps they haven't grown that much or changed that much. If you ask someone after they've completed college if they know more, if they're smarter now than they were 4 years ago, they may overreport how smart they are now compared to how smart they were then or how much they knew, because they expect after 4 years of education to be very different in that particular respect, when in fact they may not be. There's also the egocentric bias, and this deals with expectations in a slightly different way. So here, we often recollect our past behavior such that it portrays us in the best light possible. And this obviously touches on an issue from a previous lecture, that is demand characteristics. In an experiment, a person often behaves the way they think people would want them to, or in the way that they think makes them look best. And egocentric bias is similar. So here we're asking about recollections of past experiences or past behavior. And people will often report that their behavior was more charitable or more sociable than it actually was, because that's the way that we want to view ourselves, and it's the way we want others to view us. Uh, and again, it's not a deceptive practice. It's not that people will remember the truth and then indicate something else. Uh, they actually seem to recollect a different version of their own behavior than what they actually did at the time. There are a couple other biases that have to do with our recollections, and one of them is what's called a choice supportive bias, and this is related to egocentric bias. But this is where we, uh, again, retroactively filter uh, our past experiences and the knowledge we had in the past in order to support our own choices. So, when asked why you bought the car that you did, uh, you'll often report a lot of positives about the car and a lot of negatives perhaps about the other cars you were considering, when in fact you may not have had that information at the time. And so people tend to recollect that their choices were more obvious in a sense uh, than they actually were. Their choices may have been fairly arbitrary, and yet people will recollect having information that supported those choices, even when they didn't. And finally, and this is one of the most famous biases, is the hindsight bias. And the hindsight bias deals with our ability to predict events in our lives. And so when something happens, we certainly aren't good at predicting everything in our lives. Something happens and maybe we didn't predict it. But afterwards, we think of it, we remember it as being more predictable than it was. Saying, oh yes, it was fairly obvious that was going to happen. They may even say, I knew it was going to happen. And they could even say that, oh, I said it was going to happen all along. And so hindsight bias is about our tendency to think of ourselves as being better at predicting our lives than we actually are. And again, this can even manifest itself in terms of false memories. People saying that they'd been predicting this all along, that they always knew this. This was always going to happen. It was inevitable. When in fact it was not predicted at all. So that's what the hindsight bias is our tendency to retroactively uh, think of ourselves as knowing what was going to happen. Okay, and the final sin of memory is persistence, which is the recollection of events, the ability to retrieve them, which sounds good, but when this happens to an intrusive degree, it can be a negative thing. And so if there are events that we've witnessed that we don't want to remember or don't want to recall very often, and yet we seem to recall them very frequently, that can be intrusive. It can disrupt our lives. And so this is related to the idea of what are called flashbulb memories. And flashbulb memories are usually emotionally charged, often traumatic memories of events in which we remember lots of details that we wouldn't otherwise remember. So people remember where they were and what they saw, what they were doing uh, when the Kennedy assassination happened, or more recently, when September 11th occurred. And so people tend to remember very vividly what was going on around them. And that is what those flashbulb memories are, those emotionally charged memories with lots of detail. And so emotion, which we'll talk about in a later unit, is a big player in these memories. Emotions can have a powerful influence on whether we remember events in our lives or not. And in particular, especially for traumatic events, the amygdala is an important part of the brain for these flashbulb memories. Now, the amygdala, of course, is part of the limbic system. It deals with emotions. And in particular, it's most famous for dealing with fear. And again, these are often traumatic memories. And so it's thought that the amygdala is an important part of determining how vividly these memories are stored. Uh, and in fact, people that have had damage to their amygdala do not recall traumatic events to the same degree, with the same vividness. Uh, and so these intrusive memories, and especially the involvement of the amygdala and the fear response, uh, are thought to be heavily involved in things like post-traumatic stress disorder, where a traumatic event can be associated with a vivid memory, and a memory that comes up even when the person doesn't want to. And so they retrieve that memory sort of involuntarily. There's been some work that's been done on therapeutic approaches to these flashbulb memories and traumatic events. Uh, we talked last time about reconsolidation, about disrupting reconsolidation, so that perhaps memories aren't as traumatic if the person retrieves them, and then you disrupt the reconsolidation process through distraction or other techniques. Um, there's also some evidence that if you can suppress some of the physiological responses soon after a traumatic event occurs, that memory is stored less vividly. So after a traumatic experience, a person's sympathetic nervous system is often very active. So you have an increase in heart rate, a shutdown of the digestive system, increased breathing, increased pupil dilation. So all of these are physiological changes that occur in the body during trauma. However, if you apply a drug that blocks this physiological arousal, there's some evidence that you can also diminish how traumatic that memory becomes. So all of these have to do with arousal and the emotional state of the person when the event is witnessed. And again, these memories can be intrusive. You can have more recollection of them than you really want. So the question is why we have these seven sins of memory. Uh, and some of the answer here is that we have limits in our capacities. So we can't remember everything. We also can't put everything into short-term memory. So again, our long-term memory doesn't seem to have a capacity, but our short-term memory does. And so that may form sort of a bottleneck. We have to be a little more selective about what we're going to remember and what we're not, because we can't hold everything in short-term memory. And so when we forget certain pieces of information, it may be that those pieces of information didn't get to long-term memory, or perhaps they did, but we have difficulty retrieving them later because we have bottlenecks in our capacity. Also, things like attention, especially when it comes to absent-mindedness. We have limits on our attentional capacity. We can't pay attention to everything at once. And so if we need to pay attention to something in order to remember it, we may not be able to store that information. We may be trying to pay attention to something else. Of course, the errors aren't all bad. They, to a certain degree, many of them help with efficiency. So, as we mentioned with transients, we don't want to remember everything. That could be really disruptive. So you don't want to store irrelevant information. Not because you're up against some storage limit. Again, long-term memory doesn't seem to have limit. But storing, processing that information in the first place, selecting all of it to store, the energy it takes to change synapses in order to store all the information, these things all cost time, cost energy. And so your brain selects what information is likely relevant and needs to be stored and what doesn't. And so storing everything would be really inefficient. So some of these errors uh, are are the result of an evolutionary tendency not to waste a lot of energy and resources. Also, some of the errors may be sort of side effects of our mental flexibility. So when it comes to imagining the future, for example, that's an important capacity. It helps us plan, helps us think of alternate scenarios. Uh, that way we don't have to experience everything. We can try to imagine certain experiences and then make decisions based on that. But that ability to imagine, to take real information and mix it in with false information or some possible future, that may be the reason that it's so easy for us to misattribute memories, or that it's so easy for us to take suggestions and incorporate them into actual memories. So our ability to think of things that aren't actually true may have a lot to do with why we're able so often to incorporate untrue information into our memories, which we often wish were a perfectly accurate record, but the fact is that they're not. Okay, so that'll do it for this time. Next time, we will start a new unit, and we will be talking about intelligence. So first, of course, we have to define what intelligence means. And it's not as easy a thing to define as you might think. There are multiple forms of intelligence. And the reason we're doing this unit next is that certain kinds of intelligence are related to certain kinds of memory, but other forms of intelligence are not. So we'll talk about that. So how is intelligence structured? What are the components of intelligence as far as we know? And finally, what determines intelligence? To what degree is it based genetically or environmentally or developmentally? So what determines how intelligent, so to speak, a person ends up being? So we will cover that in our next unit, and I will see you then.